So the topic of my talk is obviously the people before the Mayflower in Duxbury. And I'd like to start with saying I have no Wampanoag heritage and I have no Pilgrim heritage, zero on both sides. But I'm fascinated in the history of this area. And I know Dennis, who has artifacts, has a little bit of First Nation Canada heritage. But the talk tonight, the outline will be an overview of ancient travel. I'm into genetics also and language. It's going to be a New England focus, 16th and 17th century, then a Duxbury focus, and then some local artifacts. So all our ancient beginnings, all humans, recent DNA evidence shows that we all have a common heritage out of Africa. And everyone, this little yellow marker, anyone around the world except Africans have the same marker on our DNA. And 50,000 years ago, all people that settled in Europe separated that away. All people that settled in Asia that away 50,000 years ago. And about 15,000 years ago, people came from Asia into North America, and the genetics now is so precise, they're showing, and there's a lot of complexity about this that I'm not going to talk about, but basically genetic heritage can tell where your ancestors traveled, where you came from. And so when the Pilgrims and the Mayflower came here in 1620 and met the Wampanoag, their cultures had been separated for 50,000 years. So 50,000 year separation of language, food, culture, clothing, and totally different cultures meeting in 1620. So when did the Wampanoags and the Native Americans first come here? Their story is the Wampanoag Story, which is the Native American tribe of the southeast Massachusetts, is that they've been here forever. But the Laurentide ice sheet covered all of New England 20,000 years ago and slowly melted 21,000, 15,000, 14, and by 12,500 New England was free of ice again. And humans started coming in from the south to New England about 14,700 years ago. And Duxbury was way out past Provincetown, the land, and off Chatham, all the banks were land. And you could walk to Martha's Vineyard in Nantucket, and there was a ginormous lake called Glacial Lake Hitchcock, which is now the Connecticut River. So times when people first came here, 14,700 years ago, the landscape, the plants, the animals, everything was dramatically different. When first people came, there were mastodons, giant beaver, sloths, totally different landscape. And this is from the Cape Cod Canal. It's a mastodon tooth. And mastodons have been found out on Stillwagon Bank, Cape Cod Canal, and in various places. And this is called a Clovis point, which was used to kill mastodons in the early, it's called the Paleolithic period. And suddenly there was an event called the Younger Dryas event. And in about 12,800 years before present, all 35 big species died out and the climate changed dramatically. And some scientists say it's due to a meteorite, some say it's due to a volcano, and there's still debate about what caused this event. But the landscape changed dramatically. So when did the Wampanoag settle our area? And their verbal traditional stories are that they have been here forever, but they were putting wind turbines out on Nantucket Shoal, on Horseshoe Shoal in Nantucket Sound. And a Wampanoag historical officer, Chucky Green, said, "It's a place where our ancestors are buried. It is a place that is principal to our practices. An unobstructed view of the eastern sun is paramount to our religion." And their oral tradition is that their ancestors were hunting out off these areas and these areas. Artifacts are found, they wash up, and their oral tradition matches the geology. And another thing that you can tell about when people settle areas is by their language and the way language travels. This is a map of European languages started out as Proto-European, Indian, and then Italian, Latin, Scottish, all the Iranian languages, Greek languages, all came from a common place. And you can see over time, and you can tell how languages travel when people settle different areas. And a Russian linguistic specialist found the Algonquin, which is the language of the whole East Coast Native American tribes, was related to a language in Russia called Nif. And the Nif language, which is Sakhalin Island and the Amur River in Siberia, traveled. And this map is Native American languages in 1830, before what's known as the Trail of Tears. And President Andrew Jackson moved a lot of tribes in what's known as the Trail of Tears, but the language maps prior to 1830 shows how people settled. And the Nif language went to this Waukeshan and Salishan language, and then to Algonquin, and then down. The ice caps melted, went up, and the Algonquin language settled all here. And actually, most of the Algonquin language-speaking people are still in those areas, but some from here have been moved to the west. But everyone in the Chesapeake Bay North, Native American, speak a variation of Algonquin, and all of Canadian First Nations. So for instance, in the Nifk language, dog is a Kwan, and in Algonquin, in Wampanoag, dog is a Kwan, and belly is a talk, and in Wampanoag, belly is a talk. Cold in Russian Nip is Khan, and cold in Wampanoag is Khan. Home in Nip is a two, and in Wampanoag it's a way two. So you can see the correlation between this Russian language and southeastern Massachusetts Wampanoag. And in the 1990s, this woman who's a Wampanoag, Jessie Little Doe Bear, she had a dream 3 nights in a row, and the Wampanoag language at that time was not spoken. And 3 nights in a row, she had a dream of her ancestors speaking her native language. And on the 3rd night, they told her she had to revive the language in her dreams. And she woke up on the 3rd night, and she signed up the next week for language studies, and she got accepted into the MIT language program using old textbooks from when the Pilgrims met the Wampanoags and they wrote the language down. She revived the language, and she won a MacArthur Genius Grant, and now there's hundreds of kids down in Mashpee and out in Aquinnah and other places that have a Wampanoag language reclamation project, and there's kids being raised that are spoken their native language. So it's a really interesting, it was the first time in our country's history that an extinct language was brought back and is spoken. So how do you know when artifacts that you find in Duxbury, how old they are. And humans change designs. And so you can tell a 1957 Chevy from a 2019 Chevy. And you know Greek classical vases are this short time period, certain design. And the same with all artifacts. And artifacts change design, they change typology. And when you match where you find them in the soil to the carbon dating and other means of testing, you can tell exactly what time and what era they're from. And humans coming into this area change designs over time. And they also change, this is a very technical archaeological paper, and I won't get into the details, but it shows people exchanging stones, lithics, all over New England, and meeting and exchanging, and this is thousands and thousands of years ago. The oldest Native American point found in New England to date is on the Connecticut River in Northampton, where the Northampton Fairgrounds are. There's a 12,800 before present point found, and then up the river at Mount Sugarloaf, 12,350, and the whole Mount Sugarloaf region near Amherst in Sunderland, enormous finds of Native Americans, and they would hunt caribou in that area. There's another site up in Maine called the Vale Site, and that has an age of 12,600 years before present. And to give you a sense of the time, this would be before the Egyptian dynasties. The Egyptian dynasties started 5,000 years before present, 4,000 BC. Actually, that would be 6,000 years before present. So humans were in New England before the Egyptian dynasties. Another ancient site is in Jervis Fall. And closer to us, when you're stuck in traffic on Route 128 in Canton, and if you look up, there's a cave kind of structure, and it's at the bottom of the Blue Hills, and it's called the Wampanoag Site. It was studied for years. These are some of the points on it, and this site is where the name Massachusetts comes from. It means, Massachusetts means at the foothills, and it's at the foothills of the Blue River that the Blue Hills on the Neponset River that the first people that came here settled. And this area has been studied by archaeologists. Closer to us is Ashume, Lakeville. This is where we are right here, Duxbury, and Lakeville's right here. Lake Ashume in Lakeville, right here at this point, was the largest herring run on the East Coast from the Neponset River and the Taunton River. And then New Bedford used their water supply here, and it stopped the herring run. But Native Americans, their first spring, they moved seasonally, but herring runs were incredibly important. And they settled 10,000 years before present in these circular structures at the head of Lake Apsawamsett. And one of the artifacts is called a Thunderbird Petroglyph, and it's a symbol for warriors, and it imparted bravery for hunters. Also, this is Route 24. This is the Taunton River, and this was found on what's called the Taylor Farm, and seals would chase the herring up the Neponset River, and there was a bend in the river, and the Native Americans could capture the seal, and these bifurcate points were designed just for seal capture.
Harpoon points.
Harpoon points.
Yeah.
Another interesting local artifact is in Boston. When they were building the Boylston Station, they came upon an ancient fish weir, 5,002. It was used for over 2,000 years. And a fish weir is a big net that was put across the Charles every, I don't know what seasons, probably spring through fall, to capture fish. And when they were digging the Boylston Tea Station, all the fish weir was in place still. And they called in archaeologists, and it's up at the Peabody Museum on a display. It's fascinating. And it ran across Newbury Street. And this was all marsh, and this is where the fish would come in from Boston Harbor, and they'd capture them in this fish weir, Native Americans. And every year they have a celebration for the Wampanoag ceremony. And you can see all the fish weir artifacts up in Andover at the Peabody Museum. So Duxbury was 10,000 years ago. The land was way out here. So when people first moved into this area, as I mentioned, the land was here, it slowly it rose, and this is our current shoreline. But even 5,000 years ago, it was quite different here. And the other thing that was different was there was a glacial Lake Taunton feeding the Jones River into our bay, and the Jones River was much more forceful and bigger. And over time, as Native Americans moved in, they had different tribes set up. In our area, the Wampanoag tribe is Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, all of Cape Cod, and the Massachusetts border is right north of Marshfield was the Massachusetts tribe. These two tribes spoke the same language and with slight variations, and Martha's Vineyard developed also a different slight variation, and Nantucket spoke the same as all here. So this whole area could communicate together, and these had different Algonquin slight language differences. But there was a lot of trading between Massachusetts, Wampanoag, the Vineyard, and Martha's Vineyard, and Nantucket. So our area was called Pawtuxet, the Bay, and the Mattapoisett is, let's see, this would be Pawtuxet, the whole bay, and Mattapoisett was the ponds up where the Heron Run, and Duxbury used to be all of Pembroke all the way back here. And in 1650, this man Timothy Hatherley, a pilgrim, went to court to start an iron mill up at Foundry Pond in Pembroke, which is now Pembroke. And he started, he applied to do an iron mill, and someone in the 1700s read this court document where he brought 5 Native Americans to explain where Mattapoisett and where Pawtuxet was. And whoever read it in the 1700s misinterpreted where Mattapoisett was. It was actually at the Pembroke Heron Run. So the Mass Historical Commission has said this area, our whole bay, is Pawtuxet, and Mattapoisett was the whole North River, but particularly the Heron Runs up at the ponds. So in Duxbury, a lot of things are named Mattapoisett, and in the early days, Pembroke was Mattapoisett, and Duxbury, part of Duxbury, was called Mattapoisett. But it's sort of an urban myth that current Duxbury boundaries was called Mattapoisett. And there's a Oddfellows Hall, and a ship, and the student council, and there's the Lane Mattapoisett Court leading to the harbor master's office. But in reality, the bay was called Pawtuxet, and Pembroke was Mattapoisett. Other Mattapoissetts are a Heron Run in Martha's Vineyard, a Heron Run in Mattapoisett on the Bass River, and in Barnstaple, a Heron Run. So Mattapoisett means place of little fish, and it's always signifies a Heron Run. And last week, I think Pembroke announced they had 400,060 heron cross the upper North River there at the Heron Run in Pembroke. So this is Mattapoisett and this is Pawtuxet, ancient. And the other big settlements were Tippecanoe, the whole Taunton River, Nemaskett, and Wampanoag was the whole Lake Assawampset Pond area. So Samuel de Champlain, a French explorer, came to our bay in 1605, and he also was a cartographer and an artist, and he drew what it was like to enter our bay. Here's the Gurnet, Duxbury Beach. Saquesh was an island then, the sand dunes hadn't connected. Clark's Island. This over here is Duxbury, and there's a long story about all the different points that would take a long time to explain, but I won't. But I wanted to point out that people lived with wetus, which are their homes, summer homes, and cornfields. There was no forest except on the Gurnet and Manomet. Everything, they had a burning practice that Verrazano wrote about in the 1500s. Native Americans burned the land seasonally, planted, went to a different area. So there was not forest in this area in 1605. And he wrote about many people, and interestingly, he wrote about a Ashume, which is a Wampanoag boat, and fishermen, and they gave him his their fish spears. And this is what a Ashume is. In other areas they do birch bark canoes, but in the Wampanoag area they take a pine tree and they burn it, and they use a gouge, which Dennis has over there, and they burn the pine tree into this long boat called a Ashume, which is seaworthy. I don't know if I would do it, but... So this is how Samuel de Champlain, when he came in here in 1605, wrote about our bay. And he talks about, there came to us 2 or 3 canoes which had just been fishing for cod and other fish, which are found here in large numbers. They catch their fish with hooks made of a piece of wood to which they attach a bone in the shape of a spear and fasten it very securely. The whole has a fang shape, and the line attached to it is made of the bark of the tree. They gave me one of their hooks, which I took as a curiosity. And he writes about all the people and what he found. So that was 1605. And in 1618, there was a great comet that was seen throughout the world. It was visible to the naked eye, September 6th through 25th. And later, this man, Thomas Morton, wrote about the Native Americans in this area during the time of the Great Comet, suffered enormous diseases, plagues, all sorts of diseases. And he wrote, some of the ancient Indians that are surviving it, this writing thereof, do affirm that some 2 or 3 years before the first English arrived here, they saw a blazing star, a comet, which is a forerunner of the sad mortality, for soon after it came upon them in extremity. That's from the New England Memorial by Nathaniel Morton. And in Europe in the 1300s, the Black Death, the plague came, and for 400 years it went throughout Europe and killed millions of people. And people in Europe built up a resistance to all sorts of diseases, but millions of people died. And then the Europeans came to our area. Native Americans had no resistance. This shows Europe and the plague, and the plague actually came from the Middle East and hard-hit areas, and 1300s to 1500s, terrible death. And then now, just lately, they've looked at people's DNA, and people of European descent have this CCR5 delta 32 allele, which gives you a resistance to smallpox, the plague, all these diseases. And it's it's missing in American Indian populations. And it's your ancestors that lived through the 13th, 14th, 15th century in Europe that gave you this resistance, and all the Europeans brought it to the Native Americans. So diseases that ravaged Europe slowly over 300 years ravaged Native Americans over 40 years. Hemorrhagic plague, smallpox, hepatitis, yellow fever, tuberculosis. They had no genetic resistance to all the European diseases. And it's estimated that more than 90% of Native Americans died in what is now coastal New England from 1616 to 1619. And actually, in our bay, 100% died. And the only one that survived was Squanto, who was captured. It's a big, long story that would take me an hour to explain. But he came back and helped the pilgrims, and he came back to his native town, and he found no one living here. So this man, Emmanuel Altham, in 1623, wrote from Plymouth. And now I will speak somewhat of the people in the country the Native Indians. The nearest that any dwell into Plymouth is 14 miles away, and their town is called Manamet. Only within our fence dwells one Habamock, his wife and his household, above 10 persons, who is our friend and interpreter. And he actually lived with Miles Standish. And one who he moved from Plymouth and he lived in Duxbury, Habamock, up on Standish Shore with Miles Standish. And one whom we have found faithful and trusty. He and I carry away with me to the southward. And now likewise in this bay wherein we live, in former time hath lived about 2,000 Indians. Here is not one living now, nor not one living which belonged to this plantation before we came, so that the ground on which we planted belongs to nobody. But a lot of Wampanoags survived, particularly Martha's Vineyard and south, but coastal New England, which took a lot of the European fishermen and their diseases, which they didn't know they were imparting. So the Wampanoag still has a number of tribes. There are currently 5 organized groups of Wampanoag: Ashume, Gayhead, Herring Pond, Mashpee, and Namasket. And the U.S. Census had 2,336 registered Wampanoags. And there's a Wampanoag home site at Plymouth Plantation. There's a Wampanoag museum in Mashpee, and there's another museum out in Gayhead, or Aquina, which used to be named Gayhead, out in Martha's Vineyard. So in our area, there's a number of archaeological sites. In Kingston, there's 65 sites, 5 broad areas. In Plymouth, there's 163 sites, 6 broad areas. In Duxbury, there's 4 sites, 12 broad areas. And there's 262 Native American archaeological sites in the 3 towns around our bay, in 23 broad areas. And there's submerged sites, which are unknown, because thousands of years ago the land was out further. There's 2 museums in the area that have some of the artifacts from our area. The Henry Hornblower collection is in the basement of Plymouth Plantation. They have thousands of artifacts from Duxbury, Kingston, and Plymouth, and they're planning new exhibits perhaps about them. And the Robbins Museum in Middleborough has thousands of artifacts donated: Plymouth, Kingston, Duxbury, along with the rest of the state, Rhode Island, etc., and interpretive areas. Wampanoags all Native Americans didn't live in one place year-round like we say we have a home. They lived seasonally between winter hunting grounds and spring alewife runs, summer fishing grounds, fall deer hunting, food preservation, for winter sites, and homes could be packed up in one day, and people moved 40 miles to a new site in one day. Dennis has a copy of this book over here, but if you ever find an artifact and you want to know how old it is, a book by Jeff Boudreau called The New England Typology you can take your artifact and match it, and it will tell you exactly what century, when, how, etc. it was made. And it's very fascinating that you can match artifacts to time periods. The oldest artifacts in our area, this is a collection by a man named Bernie Otto, and he's passed away, but this point right here is a late Paleo point. It was found on Cherry Street overlooking Plymouth Harbor. And in Duxbury, the oldest artifact was found in the Howland Farm Peach Orchard on Bay Road, which is now sold, and I think it's going to be homes. But the University of Bridgewater State University did a dig there, and they found a 10,000-year-old artifact, which is in their collection. I took a picture of it, couldn't find it, but I visited it. It's a paleo point that was found overlooking our bay in the peach orchard. But the most artifacts in our area are found at Bay Farm. And this is Bay Farm, tons of artifacts, and every star here is a Native American artifact site. And the Jones River was where millions of herring came up every spring. Colonial people put 5 dams on the waterfalls there, so the herring stopped. They're now taking down the dams at Elm Street and other places, but they moved seasonally into this area, and Bay Farm was probably lived on for 8,000 years. These are some of the Bay Farm artifacts. Lots of technical terms and explanations for, but it was mainly fishing, corn growing, grinding, food preparation, hunting. This is a pestle for corn grinding, fish spears. These are fish spears. This is a very early Bay Farm artifact. Hunting. More Bay Farm artifacts. These are some Dennis's. I don't know if you have this plate here, Dennis, but you could explain it afterwards. Powell site, which is Bay Farm. And plummets. Dennis brought some plummets here. And what's amazing about the plummets, they're fish sinkers, and they clearly fished in our bay. But they're from 9,000 years before present to 6,000 years before present. They're fishing at off Bay Farm. And this is an auction I went to. This is a gouge to make a Ashume from Bay Farm. And these are plummets from Bay Farm. And they were also strung together in a net to create a circle. And they netted the beginning of the Jones River for herring as they came up. But to think of these plummets being 9,000, 6,000 years old is amazing, and there's some of them on the table right there.
Some of the same designs.
Yeah, no, and plummets. And these are gouges to make machoons, chunky stones. These are atlatl weights, which are a type of spear throwing instrument, and more plummets from Bay Farm. Also very prolific was Rocky Nook. That was the home of John Howland, a pilgrim, and John Howland was given Rocky Nook in the 2nd Division of land, and off to the sides of his land, one of his ancestors, Mary Hathaway, gave the right to this guy, Bernie Otto, to excavate on the land. And there was thousands of artifacts found. And what's interesting about Rocky Nook is the artifacts were bigger, and it made people think that they went out to sea from Rocky Nook through our bay out, and a lot of the artifacts could be used on large sea mammals. Another big site is a former pilgrim, former Governor Bradford. His whole farm was this, as we learned last week from Monty's lecture, if you went here, was that Duxbury was all of the Jones River to 1850, and then in a dispute with Kingston gave over this part to Kingston. Well, Governor Bradford's farm was across from Stop and Shop all the way down to the Jones River, and Maple Street, which cuts through it, Kingston was putting in sewer lines in the 1990s, in 1999, and they came across this ginormous, that's a technical term, ginormous Native American site, and the archaeologists said it was one of the most well-preserved villages they'd ever contacted. And what was fascinating about it was it contained European beads from Venice from the 1500s and trading beads from France. And you could see fishermen and other people coming in, people that didn't write about their travels, and the woodland era, 1500s, meeting and trading beads, and all the beads were found on Maple Street. They wanted to make it a National Historic Monument area, but it didn't happen. But the site, it's called the Tura Farm. It's on Maple Street still, but it's been written up. This is Dennis's at the Bradford House in Kingston on the edge of Maple Street there. And what's interesting is the artifacts are broken because hunters would bring back game, and broken artifacts means it's a home site. So you would imagine the knoll overlooking the Jones River, and this was underneath the Bradford House. The Jones River was very different than we know it now. There were 5 waterfalls and a big active Heron Run when the Pilgrims first came here. John Porey wrote a letter in 1622. Into another river some 2 miles up to the northeast of Plymouth, all the month of May the great smelts passed to spawn, likewise in troops innumerable, which with a scooper bowl or a piece of bark a man may cast up upon the bank. And it was not forested, and great fishing. And herring are very important to all First Nations, and they play a central role. When the herring start running, you move to your spring settlement. Then the stripers follow, the cod follow, the big fish, summer fish follow, and you plant your corn when the herring start, and it became a very important time. So you could see great herring running up the Jones River and people moving to Bay Farm for the summer season. So when Champlain came in July, there were many people, lots of corn, and lots of fishermen. And you could see why this region of Duxbury and Kingston was so prolific with Native American artifacts. Other places where we have found Native American artifacts. I was on a dig in the I forget what year, second meeting house on Chestnut Street, and Craig Chartier, the archaeologist, and we found the outline of the second meeting house next to the old cemetery, and underneath the meeting house were 200 Native American artifacts. So Native American artifacts right below the Duxbury second meeting house. This is the Voses property. Terry and Judy Vos are right here. And this is not where they live, but it's a long story, the whole Rachel Carson connection. But near their property are cracked firestone. There's a pond in the middle of Standish Shore where the Voses live. And 15 years ago, Terry invited me to go skating there with his grandson and my daughter. And they were doing construction, and there was an enormous showman in the construction. And I had worked on the Central Artery project as an urban designer, and I was charged with doing Spectacle Island, and that's 30 years ago. And that's where I learned about shell mid-ins and archaeology, and went skating with Terry and his grandson and my daughter, and there was this enormous shell midden and ancient artifacts all around this little pond in the middle of Standish Shore. And this is some of the midden with artifacts sticking out, shells sticking out, and this is the construction zone, and you can see. And this was, I would guess, a food preparation site because there was evidence of fire-cracked rock, and the Native Americans would dry seafood for the winter. And they would dry deer, and they would mix cranberries and make food that could be kept all winter. And there was a fresh water spring there. It could have been used all year round, but I think it was a food preparation area. And what's so fascinating to me is oysters were there. And if you know Duxbury, Skip Bennett came in the 1990s and started aquaculture of oysters, and there was no oysters in our bay. But if you look, this is from the Cram collection in the Kingston Library. There were gigantic oysters 5,000 years ago in our bay, and they're preserved in shell middens because the calcium preserves all the shells. So oysters are big business in Duxbury now, but they were a food source thousands of years ago. There's also at the Robbins Museum this bowl, and this is a later bowl, ceramic bowl. There's all sorts of eras of different bowls in Native American terminology, but this would be set, there'd be a fire below it, and it'd be set in the ground, and stews and food preparation, and this was found in a shell midden. Also, if you've been on Duxbury Beach and you drive across the bridge and you see the seagulls drop quahog shells, there's quahog shells all over Duxbury Beach, and the purple part of the quahog was ground down and mixed with the white part, and it became wampum, which was a form of trade of almost money to Native Americans in this area. And this is a wampum, an actual ancient wampum necklace that is actually from Plymouth, but it shows the quahog shells and the amount of drilling and stonework needed to create these valuable necklaces. Another important site for Native American artifacts was in North Hill. It was a winter site, and it was excavated in the 1960s by a man named Donald Scawthorne with permission from the town. And he found the outline of the longhouse, which is a winter encampment, 20 by 30. It'd be similar to this, and it's where everyone would live with fires in the winter. He also found 4 weitus and tons of concentration of wort chips, and he also found seafood that people would, just like oystermen go out in the middle of winter to get oysters, people in their winter encampment would go out in the bay and get shellfish and bring it back to North Hill. And he found lots of evidence, lots and lots of deer and antler points, and he also found caribou bones, which is fascinating because caribou don't range down here. So it's unclear, did they get caribou down here? Did they go north to get caribou? But there was caribou bones in North Hill. And what was most fascinating to me was he found a fisherman's cache, exactly like Champlain described, these points that were connected with a wood circle somehow and connected with tree bark for fishing. And these are spears for larger fish. And what's interesting about our bay before overfishing, this is the size of codfish in the 1800s. And now, of course, they're much smaller. But cod in the 1400s was gigantic. So to fish for a cod, you needed a spear with something that would pull it back, and these would be for smaller fish. And he found a Thunderbird, which is a symbol for a warrior, for bravery, and also a Welk pendant. So here's in North Hill the artifacts of an ancient fisherman who went out on our bay and used exactly the artifacts that Champlain talked about. And a few hundred yards, I live near North Hill, and lives David Bitters, the bayman, who goes out now. He posts on Facebook his, what he uses to fish. He goes out and gets stripers, and he's the same kind of warrior fisherman that for thousands of years. And so it's fascinating that these artifacts were found and showed people in our area. There was also a dig up at the William Brewster, the Reverend William Brewster, elder, up on Standish Shore, his home site where the lilacs are. There was a dig in 2012, and I participated in that, and we found the outline of Elder William Brewster's house, and below it were I forget how many artifacts, many artifacts. I'd say more than 200 artifacts, Native American artifacts below Elder William Brewster's house, and a gouge, and a chunky stone for playing, it was a game. And these were all on exhibit at the Duxbury Native Historic Society in the King Caesar barn. And there's a report on everything that was found. And across the street was the old Standish Hotel, and there was a spring, a water spring, and there's a great Native American site there. But the land went out much further. So people who walk the beach there have found hundreds of Native American artifacts actually on the beach. And also at the Standish home site, there's lots of artifacts that have been found, Native Americans living there. And I actually found a 3,000-year-old artifact just walking the beach. You walk down these stairs and there's a beach there, and there it was just lying on the beach. And I took it to the Robbins Museum, and an expert identified it. But there was a stone axe found below Standish's home. So Native Americans, the Pilgrims settled on ancient Native American sites. So when they excavate a pilgrim site, below it you always find, in this area, Native American. This is a friend of mine who's passed on, Polly Nash. She lived on Chapel Street, and she was hanging her laundry, and some stone kept bothering her while she was hanging her laundry, and she pulled it up, and it was a 5,000-year-old atlatl, this is how it was used, spear point, and the atlatl, they think, was at a point, and it's an interesting story the way she found it. And her husband, who's also passed on, John Nash, who was from Pilgrim heritage, this is a painting of the Bluefish River. He found, while he was gardening, wading river points 4,000 to 2,700 years old on the Bluefish River. And then Ned Lawson, who was the former executive director of the Maritime School, and now his son is the executive director, has a beautiful house overlooking the Bluefish River. So we're over here, and the Bluefish River comes through here, and his house is on a bluff. And he's a great gardener, and while he gardens, he finds all these Native American artifacts. And I had an archaeologist look at them, and he identified them as 3,000 to 5,000 years old. And this is like not less than a mile from here, overlooking the Bluefish River. And then in the 1930s and 40s, Dr. Bacchus, who owned the King Caesar House, he was a professor of comparative anatomy at Brown, and later he was president of Tufts. He lived at the King Caesar House, and he had this boat called the Maya, which Ted Kennedy later took. It's a big, long story also. But he would take it out to Clark's Island, and he would bring back artifacts. And he had a boathouse on what is now Bumpus Park, looking across the King Caesar House. And Dennis, when he was young, just a few years ago, went to the boathouse as a kid with his father and saw Dr. Bumpus's He had like 2,000 artifacts on plates in this boathouse across from the King Caesar House, and he also had artifacts from all over Duxbury. And Reverend Benjamin Kent, who was the minister from First Parish in 1829, he preached on Sundays, but he did archaeology Monday through Friday. And he actually, I just learned tonight through some other historian, got kind of railroaded out of town. But he had 5,000 Native American artifacts that he found around Duxbury. Another big place is this is the high school. What is that? Where am I? Yeah. This is the high school. This is the former old track, which is now a football field. But this is called Onion Hill, and when the Wrights lived here, she built a horse track. And when they were building the horse track, they found thousands of Native American artifacts overlooking the back river. And then Camp Chala Chala was a camp in the 1970s. They found thousands of Native American artifacts here overlooking the back river during an excavation in the 70s, with some of the campers participating. And the library, which used to be the high school, Dennis Martin went to this high school, and he would walk out and there'd be, instead of like playing with other kids, he would search for artifacts in the back of the high school, which is right here. And this area was obviously an ancient site of habitation. Roland Robbins did an excavation of the first Alden House in the 1960s. So we're right here on the second house, and wait a minute, we're right here. And the first house, I think, was right here. The original Alden House is right here, over behind the high school. And Roland Robbins did an excavation of the house in the 1960s, and he found the original John Alden House, and underneath it he found 2,000 Native American artifacts that he wrote about in his report about the 1960 dig. So we're sitting right here, and this is where the original home site is. This is where Ned Lawson's, this is Pauline John Nash's. This over here would be the Reverend Kent's. This would be Onion Hill. There was a what's it called, Duck Hill excavation. And Camp Chala Chala. This is Bumpus's King Caesar House. This is the Vose property. And oystermen who have a grant out here have been finding plummets out here. So just where we're sitting tonight, there's been lots and lots of Native American artifacts found in this region. And things I don't have time to explain about, but I'm interested in, are history of corn and the Three Sisters in this region, the Native Americans that interacted with the Pilgrims, Squanto, Samoset, and Havamak, Massasoit, the treaty. His real name was Asequim, but Massasoit meant great leader. In the treaties, the whole story about where Champlain went in our bay, the trail maps. There's a map off to the side here. You could see the ancient trails, which led to our current 3A, Bow Street, etc. The whole tragic story about King Philip's War, all the things on Clark's Island. So there's a lot of stories about Native Americans in this region. So I just wanted to end with, I took this picture of the Bluefish River last week. So 402 years ago, the plague came to this area. 400 years ago, John Alden was a 19-year-old cooper in England, learning how to make barrels, and he was hired 399 years ago on the Mayflower to repair the ship. He wasn't a religious separatist, he was a tradesman. And 392 years ago, John and Priscilla were given this 100 acres, and he moved here from Plymouth with 3 children. They had 10 children right here, and the Alden kindred now is 1 million people. And some of the Alden kindred is right up here on this wall, the famous people that are part of the Alden kindred. So John Alden lived on this property till he was 89. From 29, is it 29 to 89? And he was age 29 when he moved, 27 when he got this 100 acres. He had 10 children on this. And so he was the first European to settle on this land. And all the amazing stories of the Alden kindred and what happened on this land. But he wasn't the first human on this land. And the artifacts in this area show that thousands of years of people have lived on this land. And one thing I wanted to end with was the Reverend Kent from First Parish, 5,000 artifacts, gone, disappeared. Dr. Bumpus's collection, 2,000 artifacts, gone. 4 collections from Bay Farm, gone, sold on eBay. Bernie Otto's collection in Kingston, he died and his heirs sold it all on eBay. It's gone. The Poe brothers, who did tons of excavation in Duxbury, it's out in Ohio, I think, or something I heard. And Donald Scawthorne, the North Hill artifacts with the ancient fishing stuff, sold at a yard sale. He died and his wife sold all the artifacts at a yard sale. Gone. So Dennis Martin has been collecting, this is probably, I think his wife said 5% of his collection, and he's been collecting for 60 years in this area. And I hope some institution in town realizes the history of Dennis's collection and chooses to save it, because every other collection is gone. Thank you for your time.